Hey there, I'm Farhad from Ethnotech Academy, and today we're talking about one of the most essential tools in programming, loops. If you've never coded before, you might still be familiar with loops. Think Groundhog Day,
Well, it's Groundhog Day. Again?
or Doctor Strange bargaining with Dormammu.
Dormammu, I come to bargain. Endless looped time.
These are time loops. In programming, loops are very similar. They allow you to perform a task or a set of tasks over and over again. Let's check out how they work. Loops are one of those topics that can be pretty simple, but if you dive deep enough, they can get pretty complex and difficult to understand. So let's keep this simple. We're going to break this series out into multiple parts. This part is going to focus on the basics of for loops. Now, there are four built-in loops in the Java programming language. We have for loops, while loops, do while loops, and for each loops. We'll have other videos covering the other three types of built-in loops. For now, let's focus on for loops, and we'll cover them at a basic level for this video. Now let's begin by creating a new project. We'll call this for loops. To understand why we have loops in the first place, let's look at a scenario when they would be useful. Let's say I wanted to print out the word hello several times. So we could print it out, we'll write out hello, and if I wanted to print it out maybe just a handful of times, this would be fine. It wouldn't take us much time at all. If I run this, you'll see that it just prints out hello 5 times. What if I wanted to print the word hello out 500 times or 1,000 times? That would take a very long time to print out hello that number of times. This is where loops come in. I can create a loop that will allow me to print hello as many times as I like in just a few lines. Here's what a for loop looks like. We start with the keyword for, followed by an opening and closing parentheses, and then an opening and closing set of curly braces. So this is our block of code for a for loop. Inside of these parentheses, we need to pass 3 expressions. The first is a variable that is of type int or integer. So we'll say int I equals, and we can set it to whatever value we want. I'm going to set mine to 0. Next, we have to pass a Boolean expression. Remember that a Boolean expression is an expression that results in a true or false value. This expression inside of the for loop describes how many times we want our loop to run. So we're going to start with I equals 0, and we'll continue as long as it's the case that I is less than 11. The third expression we need to pass is our update, I++. And then inside of these curly braces, we'll print out hello. Before we run this, let's comment out our previous code, just so it doesn't clash with our for loop. Let's run it and see what happens. So it printed out hello a number of times. It actually printed out exactly 11 times. Let's talk about how these expressions work and what they're actually doing. The first expression is known as the initialization. This is our starting point. Int I equals 0. Next, we have a condition. Here we're saying as long as this is true, keep running whatever task is between these curly braces. Next, we have our update, where we're incrementing the value of I. This occurs at the end of each iteration of a loop, or every time a loop runs. Let's change our values here to something smaller, and then we'll go over what's happening in each iteration of this loop. So I'm going to change, let's say I equals 1, and I is less than 4. If I run this again, this time hello gets printed 3 times. In the first iteration, I is being set to a value of 1. Next, the compiler checks is I, which is 1, less than 4. That's true, so it'll run all of the tasks that are written between these curly braces. At the end of that iteration, I gets incremented, so we say I++ to increase that value by 1. So I becomes 2. Next, the compiler checks is 2 less than 4. That's true, so it'll again run these tasks. At the end of that run, at the end of that iteration, I will get incremented again to 3. And then the compiler will check is 3 less than 4. That's true, so again it'll run these tasks and increment I again, so now I becomes 4. And then we check is 4 less than 4. That's false. So this is what will end the loop. So in just 3 lines of code, we can print out this word as many times as we like. We can print it out 3 times, or we can print it out 1,000 times. Oops. It just keeps going. We could even print it out 10,000 times by adding another 0. There we go. It just kept going. That's 10,000 prints of hello. If you're new to for loops, as you probably are if you're watching this video, I'm going to give you a task. I want you to print your name 500 times using a for loop. Pause the video here, and then we'll go over what the solution would look like. All right. Hopefully you had no trouble with that. So if we're printing out our name 500 times, we'll start with the keyword for, followed by our opening and closing parentheses, along with an opening and closing set of curly braces. We'll have our initialization variable, int I equals 1, followed by a semicolon, followed by our condition, as long as I is less than 501. We want to perform our task, and our update will say I++. Between the curly braces, we'll have our print line that just prints out our name. You could also have written this Boolean expression to say I is less than or equal to 500 rather than is less than 501. Both of these expressions would have been acceptable. All right, let's run this task. So below our 10,000 prints of hello, we have 500 prints of Farhad. In order to make clear how I is being updated in each iteration of our loop, let's have a loop that just prints out I. I'm going to comment out the previous code. So I'll comment out this for loop as well as the previous for loop. So now I have nothing running in the main method. And we'll create a for loop for int I equals 0. And as long as I is less than 11, I++, followed by our set of curly braces. And here, inside of these curly braces, we'll just print out I. So now we can see in the first iteration, we're setting our initialization to I equals 0. And then our compiler checks is I, which is 0, less than 11. That's true, so it'll run this task. And that's why we see this starting print line of 0. Next, I gets incremented to 1, and then the compiler checks whether I, which is 1, is less than 11, that's true. So then it again runs the task between the curly braces, and we see this print line of 1. I gets incremented again to 2. We check is 2 less than 11. That's true. so it prints out 2. And it continues like that as long as it's the case that this Boolean expression is true. I is less than 11. So towards the end, we see that I eventually gets incremented to 10. That gets printed, right? We check if 10 is less than 11. That's true. So it prints out I, which is 10. At that point, I gets incremented again to 11. And then the compiler will check, is it true that 11 is less than 11? That's false. So that's where the for loop will stop. Now, it's important to know that these expressions can be changed to anything. We don't have to start I at 0. We can start it at 5. If we do this, now we're checking in the first iteration, is 5 less than 11? That's true, so it'll print out the value of I, which is 5. Let's run this and see that change in practice. So we see this print line from 5 to 10 now. We can also update our Boolean expression to continue as long as I is less than 50. So now we see that the loop starts where I is equal to 5, and it prints out I, which is 5. And it's going to keep running our print line as long as it's the case that I is less than 50. So that's why we see this stopping at 49. Let's change this back to 10. And we'll change I to 0. Let's run this again. So we get this print line from 0 to 9. We can also update our update. So we don't have to increment I by 1 in each iteration. We can change it however we like. We can say I plus equals 2. So now remember that when we say plus equals 2, this is short for saying I equals I plus 2. By making that update, now in each iteration, I will increase by 2 instead of just 1. Let's run this task again. So now we see I starts at 0 and it runs that task, but now every time the task completes, I is getting incremented by 2 instead of just 1. So in the next iteration, what is 0 plus 2? 2, of course. So our Boolean expression is checking, is 2 less than 10? That's true, so it'll print out I, which is 2. And then again, I will get incremented by 2, so that 2 will become 4. And then we check, is 2 less than 10? That's true, so again, it prints out I, which is 4. And then in the next iteration, it adds 2 again, 2I, which becomes 6. We check, is 6 less than 10? That's true, so we print out 6. And then increment again by 2, so that 6 becomes 8. And we check, is 8 less than 10? That's true, so it again runs our print line, and it prints out 8. At that point, I gets incremented by 2 again and becomes 10. And then we're checking, is 10 less than 10? That's false, so that's where our for loop will stop. At this point, you know that the initialization point, as well as the Boolean condition and the update, can be changed around to perform different tasks or to change the number of iterations of your loop. Here's a question for you. So far, we've been starting at 0 or another number and moving upwards. How would you start with the number 10 and print all numbers down to 0? See if you can figure out how to do this. Pause the video here and then come back. Okay, was that challenging? Let's go over the solution. So we'll start with our keyword for, followed by our parentheses and our opening and closing curly braces. Next, let's figure out what should we pass for our 3 expressions. When we consider what the initialization point should be, we want to think about, where do we want our loop to start? We want it to start at the number 10. So here we'll say int I equals 10. Next, when we think about the Boolean expression to stop our code or to identify how many times we want to run our code, we'll look at what is the stopping point. We want to stop our code once I gets to 0. In other words, we want to continue as long as it's the case that I is greater than or equal to 0. Lastly, when we consider our update, we want to think about what does I need to be changed to in order to get from 10 down to 0. So here, we will say I minus minus to decrement I in each iteration of this loop. Next, let's print out the value of I. Before I run this, I'm going to again comment out my previous code so those print lines don't clash with my new for loop. And let's run this task. Now there's my print line from 10 down to 0. So now you have a strong basic understanding of what a for loop is and how it works. Let's talk about a common use case for loops. I'm going to delete all of the code that I have in my main method and start from scratch. For loops are commonly used along with arrays. Let's start by creating an array of strings. Before I create the for loop, recall that we can identify the length of an array by using the variable followed by .length. This will print out how many items are in that array. Also remember that we can access each value in this array using its index, and array indexes start with 0. So Michelangelo has an index value of 0, Raphael will be 1, 2, and then 3. So if I wanted to print out each value, I would do a print line for turtles 0. And then turtles 1, 2, and 3. For just 4 items, this won't take very long. But what if we had an array of 500 items or 1,000 items? Again, this is when a loop would be useful to have. Let's start by creating a for loop that just prints these index values. So we'll start with our keyword for, and then in parentheses, we'll say int I equals 0. And we want to continue as long as I is less than or equal to 3. So here, we'll say I is less than or equal to 3 because 3 is our stopping point. And we'll continue incrementing I in each iteration of this loop. If I just do a print line for I, this should print out 0, 1, 2, 3. Let's run this task. So these are the index values. Notice how those are the numbers that I need if I was going to print out each value in the array turtles. So now I can update this print line to say turtles I. And this will print out each value using the index because the value of I matches that index value that we need. Let's comment out these print lines, and then we'll run our code. So again, we see this print line of Michelangelo, Raphael, Leonardo, and Donatello. But we can still make this better. What if we actually don't know how large our array is? Maybe it's 300 values or 3,000 values. Instead of specifying a number directly like this, we can use the length of the array to identify our stopping point. Remember that the length of the array is 4. That's what we see printed over here. So instead of specifying that we want to continue our loop as long as I is less than or equal to 3, we can say as long as I is less than turtles.length, which is the equivalent of saying continue as long as I is less than 4. Let's run this task again, and you'll see that it still works exactly the same way. Here's a quick task for you. Create an array of your favorite movies, and then create a for loop to print each value in the array. Pause the video here and then come back when you're done. Okay, let's go over the solution. I'm going to create an array of strings called movies equals Rocky, Ninja Turtles, Batman, and then we'll create our for loop that still starts with I equals 0 and will continue as long as I is less than movies.length. And what is the value of movies.length? Remember that this will return an integer representing how many items are in the array. So this will give me an integer 3. Next, we can do a print line for movies I. So now we can see our 3 movies along with the 4 Ninja Turtles. That's it for this video. Please do like and subscribe if you're enjoying this content. And if there's a concept that you would like to see or a video you would like to see, please do let us know in the comments. We'll see you in the next video.